Russia's great empire ideal ended not on the Ukrainian front, but in the forests of Leningrad. In recent days, 9 prisoners sent to the Ukrainian front killed their guards and fled into the forest. This is not a simple escape. This is an announcement that Russia's prisons, its largest military resource, are about to explode. Because even for prisoners, fleeing into the forest is safer than fighting for Putin. Look at the footage. The man facing Putin is the head of the Russian Federal Penitentiary Service. So why did Russia's most powerful man have to sit in front of the cameras with the prison service director? Because the country's largest military supply source is now prisons. And this source is spiraling out of control. The message Putin wanted to convey with these images was, everything is under control. But the reality hit us in the face with a horrific uprising from the very bottom of the system. This prison break triggered a shortage of soldiers in the army. The army fell into an unimaginable desperation to overcome the manpower crisis. Now, even mentally disabled, illiterate Russian citizens are being sent to the front lines. This is not just a logistical fiasco. It means civil war for the regime. Russia's myth of inexhaustible manpower has been wiped out. There is now a wave of rebellion reaching from the front lines to St. Petersburg. The woman in the images is Lyudmila Vasilyeva, 83 years old. She was born on April 22, 1941, during the siege of Leningrad. She has spent her entire life in St. Petersburg. She is a woman who should be the most sacred figure in Putin's narrative of patriotism. She is a figure Putin should have declared a hero and featured on TV. So what happened? Lyudmila Vasilyeva went to Palace Square with an anti-war poster in her hand. The police arrested this 83-year-old woman. The Kremlin had to arrest its own hero to silence her. This incident is a disaster for the Kremlin's narrative. A figure who survived the siege and served the defense industry should be a symbol of patriotism. Instead, she is shouting that Putin's war is treasonous. This is an act that undermines the ideological front, which should be the regime's strongest bastion. This nightmare in which Vladimir Putin has trapped his own people is now dragging the entire country into chaos. Russia's military doctrine is based on continuing to feed the front line, regardless of the cost of losing hundreds of thousands of soldiers. However, this ruthless system has now turned into a self-destructive mechanism. At the heart of this collapse lies the system of forced conscription that came into effect after voluntary recruitment was halted. With monthly recruitment numbers falling into the hundreds, signing bonuses have disappeared and salaries have been cut. The Kremlin has turned to its darkest resources to feed the war at the front. Since 2022, between 140,000 and 180,000 prisoners have been released to fight. However, the myth that this source was unlimited was shattered by a shocking incident in the Leningrad region. 9 convicts killed their escorts while being transferred to Ukraine and fled into the woods. A prisoner had 3 paths before him. Each was marked by death, fear, and despair. The first path was to remain in prison, to rot behind concrete walls for 10 to 15 years, but at least with a chance of survival. There was cold, hunger, and oppression, but compared to the front lines, this was the least risky option. The second path was to go to the front lines. Being driven by Wagner or the army through the corridors of death, stretching from Bakhmut to Avdiivka, it meant almost certain death, with the possibility of being shot by your own man behind you before the enemy bullet. The third path was to escape, if necessary, by eliminating the guard. It was high risk, but it was the only path to freedom to stay alive. It was also the harshest and most desperate rebellion against the system. The prisoners saw killing the guard as a better option than entering the death machine. This shows that the prison system has ceased to be the regime's most critical source of soldiers and has become a source of internal instability. The regime's authority has been reduced to zero, even behind the most secure walls. This situation has not escaped Putin's notice. As Nexta TV points out, it is no coincidence that Putin met with the head of the Federal Penitentiary Service and reported that more than 90% of prisoners are now working. Of course, this work is nothing more than going to the front in Storm Z units. When the number of volunteers and mercenaries reached hundreds, Russian authorities were forced to change tactics. Forced conscription. A 19-year-old recently captured in Ukraine told interrogators that, with little time left on his sentence, Russian investigators suddenly added fabricated charges. Faced with the threat of years of additional imprisonment, he was forced to sign a military contract. Ukrainian intelligence services report that more than 100 forcibly imposed sentences were carried out in the first half of 2025 alone. Prisoners are faced with a sign or rot option, with prefabricated charges and limited to only 3 liters of water per week. This cruelty is the heaviest pressure a nation can exert on its own people. This situation shows how desperate Putin has become against his own people, forcing him to resort to inhumane methods. The oppression of Russian military recruiters has now become a source of internal instability, not only on the front lines, but even in the most remote and vulnerable corners of the country. The collapse of a regime is not measured solely by economic figures or losses on the front lines. The greatest collapse is the collapse of the narrative. It is the loss of its moral foundation. Russia's manpower crisis is not limited to forced recruitment from prisons. This crisis has turned into a moral collapse and an inhumane logistical fiasco. This section is the most painful and stark proof of how much Putin values human life. Research by The Telegraph revealed that Russia even sent physically and mentally disabled soldiers to the front lines. Semyon Kamenov was a 27-year-old man who was illiterate and had been diagnosed with significant behavioral disorders as a child. The Prison Medical Commission classified him as Category A and deemed him fit for military service. He was given a driver's military ID. However, his mother says he couldn't even drive a car. Shortly thereafter, he was shot in the head and killed at the front. Alexei Vakrushev was a 22-year-old young man who had spent most of his life under psychiatric care. Despite being deemed unfit for military service, he was forcibly made to sign a military contract by the police. Volkov Oleg Vladimirovich was also diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder as a child, but when he was caught for theft, he was forced to sign a military contract. A Ukrainian military expert states that this situation is quite systematic and that Russia, due to its need for manpower, is forced to recruit its citizens regardless of their health and physical disabilities. Sending these soldiers to the front is not only an ethical disaster, but also military suicide. These people cannot be trained or integrated into combat units. They are expendable items used to deplete Ukraine's ammunition. Colonel Alexander Zavtonov calls this situation a cannibalism tactic. Russia shows no restraint when it comes to human life. To the civilized world, this looks like cannibalism. But for the Russians, it has become a normal way of waging war without regard for human life. This picture reveals not only the magnitude of losses at the front, but also the deep logistical collapse of the Russian army. Russia's casualty ratio on the battlefield is approximately 1 to 1.3. That is, for every 10 wounded soldiers, 7 to 8 are saved, while 4 to 5 lose their lives. This is extremely abnormal by modern warfare standards. In advanced armies, this ratio results in a high number of wounded and a low number of deaths. When the medical system works quickly and effectively, wounded soldiers survive. Losses are minimized. So why is this ratio so deadly in the Russian army? The reason lies in 3 fundamental logistical and structural inadequacies. The helicopters, armored ambulances, or organized evacuation chains needed to transport wounded soldiers from the front lines to safe areas are almost never operational. Many soldiers wait for hours on the ground, bleeding to death. Often the only thing they wait for is death. The lack of field hospitals, mobile surgical teams, or first aid supplies prevents even the simplest interventions from being performed. Even the most basic life-saving procedures, such as stopping bleeding, applying a tourniquet, or administering shock treatment, cannot be performed. The most frightening reality is this: the Russian army is not even willing to fix these problems. Instead of setting up an evacuation system, providing medical support, and investing in human life, replacing the dead with new recruits is more economical for the Kremlin. Most of the dead soldiers could have been saved with a simple intervention at the right time. But in Russia, the value of human life is low. Within the army, it is almost zero. The scale of losses on the front lines is no longer an abstract statistic. Physical evidence of this disaster is emerging across Russia. Pokrovsk has become not a symbol of victory for Russia, but a death machine. Russia lost 25,000 soldiers in October alone, based solely on confirmed video footage. The actual figure is estimated to be as high as 28,000. This means an average of 35 soldiers lost per hour for control of a small town. This means losing more than half a person per minute in a war with no strategic logic. The logistical and tactical blindness behind these losses shows that Putin's command structure is also rotten. The confession of a Russian soldier fighting in Chasiv Yar, who says his unit has lost over 90% of its strength, is shocking. They hire people who know nothing, spending millions to recruit them. They come and die immediately. This is a cycle of waste. Millions of rubles spent on training, signing bonuses and salaries are directly converted into military waste when these soldiers die immediately on the front lines. This is proof of how the limited resources Putin spends to fuel his war economy are wasted due to the stupidity and ruthlessness of his own commanders. Moreover, this mistake is being repeated. One unit is destroyed and another follows the same path, with the same trap system and the same stupidity. Worst of all, commanders fail to learn from past mistakes. This means that the PDCA cycle, which even Japanese companies apply, has been completely abandoned in a military institution. These losses have become a physical reality in the cemetery in Novotolitsy, just outside Moscow. According to War Translated's post, 6 rows have now been completed in this cemetery, which began in 2022. But the most painful and symbolic detail: it has become nearly impossible to approach the graves, which have sunk into sand and clay. Relatives of the buried claim that this area was once a swamp. This is one of the most powerful metaphors for Putin's war. Even soldiers killed in battle are denied a dignified end. Their graves are collapsing. Soldiers are buried in the swamp. The narrative of victory and heroism is drowning in these collapsing graves across Russia. Putin's allies and propaganda machine may say everything is going according to plan, but these graves and casualty rates whisper the truth to the Russian people. Putin's war has devoured manpower. The manpower crisis has deepened so much that Russia has started recruiting mercenaries from all over the world. According to an Atlantic Council report, large numbers of Nepalese, Indian, Central Asian and African fighters are being sent to Pokrovsk. Although most are promised support roles, they too are thrown into the killing machine. Putin's laws, which provide foreign soldiers with full legal protection and easy citizenship, make it impossible for these fighters to be tried in their own countries. Russia is thus becoming a safe haven for international criminals. This is proof of how far Putin will go for victory and how much he disregards international law. The greatest danger of this war is not those lost on the front lines, but those returning home. Russian economist Igor Lipsitz warned that the return of war veterans could lead to serious social and economic difficulties. He described these soldiers as a social time bomb. During the war, soldiers became accustomed to salaries much higher than what they could earn in Russia's normal economy. These returning soldiers will not find job opportunities in Russia's dire economic situation. Putin's overheated war economy cannot offer them these salaries or similar jobs. After spending many years at war, post-traumatic stress disorder will lead to anger, aggression, and sudden violent outbursts. Anger management issues and small arms smuggling are already widespread among returning soldiers. This is the fuse for a new, silent civil war in Russia. If millions of war-weary, financially dissatisfied, and psychologically traumatized soldiers return home, maintaining social order will become nearly impossible. Moreover, there is already a shortage of 150,000 police officers in the Russian police force. Putin can no longer even ensure his own internal security. History is a warning for Putin. The Soviet Union returned defeated from Afghanistan. Millions of soldiers were labeled Afghancy and ostracized by society, unable to find work or receive mental health services. This neglect weakened the people's trust in the Soviet state. Joseph Stalin never wanted soldiers to return home. He preferred them to die. Soldiers returning from World War II were sent to the Gulag because they saw a better life in Western Europe and were more self-confident. Because a dictator does not want an army that knows how to use weapons, is angry and dissatisfied in his country. Putin's current strategy reflects this dictatorial mentality. Millions of soldiers are dying in the war and not returning. Those who do return are so weak, traumatized, or broken that they cannot resist. The most controversial proposal put forward for war veterans was the plan to send these soldiers to Siberia. Soldiers would be provided with land and financial support to start a new life in Siberia. Although this idea was presented as a reward for their service, in reality, it is an attempt to isolate soldiers from the general fabric of Russian society. This plan will feel like exile. You used the soldiers, and now you are isolating them. Implementing this plan would increase discontent among the soldiers and lead to major social chaos due to strong opposition from the local population. Vladimir Putin built his more than 20 years in power on stability, prosperity, and national pride. The grand promise behind his war on Ukraine was, "Russia will be great, and you will be safe." What we see today is the complete failure of that promise. The war is being lost not by external enemies, but by a wave of internal rebellion. Millions of traumatized and unemployed soldiers returning from the war have become Russia's social powder keg, ready to explode at any moment. These soldiers will accept neither exile to Siberia nor silence. They are a threat that Putin created with his own hands, but can never control. The Kremlin cannot prohibit prisoners from escaping or disabled soldiers from being sent to the front. They cannot silence the voice of hunger, the whisper of rebellion, or the cry of conscience. The end of this war will not be determined by the last bullet fired on the front lines, but by the silent civil war that has begun within Russia itself. Putin is struggling as his own people see the truth. This could be the final chapter of his political career. So, what do you think about this? Please share your thoughts in the comments. To stay updated on new videos, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for choosing us.